Walloping web snappers, look at the time! We're about due for a new episode of the Mediocre Spider-Man. Now, before we start, remember, the games I discuss are not necessarily mediocre, it's just the dumb name of the show. It's a play on amazing or spectacular, okay? Alright. Anyway, today we're discussing one of the most mediocre adventures in Spider-Man's video game career, Maximum Carnage. I mean, Spider-Man and Venom in Maximum Carnage. Jokes aside, while it certainly has its pros and cons, which make for a divisive gameplay experience, Maximum Carnage does have an enduring legacy as one of the more memorable superhero games of the 90s. Why exactly? Well, I'd say residual hype left over from the comic book saga, the edgy red-colored carts, Venom and Carnage's general popularity, and of course, the twerk-worthy soundtrack. But is this 16-bit brawler worth experiencing some 28 years after its initial release? Well, load up your Alpha Magni Illuminizer and send out those positive vibes, cause let's see if we can withstand the violent bloodlust that is Maximum Carnage. So yeah, we've all seen this little rainbow of death before, but as we've learned over the years, LJN was just a spin-off subsidiary label under Acclaim, a way to get around Nintendo's publishing policies in the late 80s and early 90s. They didn't actively develop their own games, but what they did actively do was not give a shit. They'd rush developers to get titles based on licensed IPs out the door in the hope that the franchise name would get them over the profit line. One such developer was Manchester-based Software Creations, who for a while specialized in getting shit out the door. They first threw their hats or boards in the ring with Silver Surfer. That was them. They followed that up with Wolverine on the NES, which, while more playable, was just as terrible. Alright, full disclosure, I owned that game growing up and I harbor a seething biased hatred for it, but it has such awesome box art though. Software Creations did put out some slightly better things, like Beauty and the Beast Double Impact, and of course, Spider-Man and X-Men in Arcade's Revenge. Yep, that was them too. Now, I'm to assume Arcade's Revenge must have been quite the hit, as less than 2 years later, they unleashed Maximum Carnage onto the Super Nintendo and Genesis in the fall of 1994. I remember being super hyped for it, as was anyone that was both into video games and comics. You'd see ads for this big red bastard in every issue of whatever during the summer of 94. Wizard Magazine, EGM, actual Spider-Man comics, they were pushing the shit out of Cletus Cassidy's New York Slaycation. And honestly, the game makes for a strong first impression, but the more you dig your claws into Maximum Carnage's flesh, you start to notice some irregularities. For those unfamiliar with the source material, a quick refresher. There's two teams, a hero one and a villain one, and they fight for 12 issues. There's really nothing more to it than that. By the end of it, no one really dies and nobody learned anything. That sounds perfect for a beat-em-up! In fact, Software Creations stayed so slavishly close to the events of the comics that it sometimes hinders the gameplay experience. So, let's start there. For whatever reason, despite the game having two marquee characters in the title, Software Creations decided that co-op was not a thing fans want in their beat-em-ups. In fact, Venom doesn't even become playable until like 3 or 4 stages in, which is insane to me. Like, why did they do this? Well, that's because canonically, that's how it plays out in the comics. First, Spider-Man needs to have a tussle with Shriek Doppelganger and then gets saved by Cloak and Dagger before Venom even hears about Carnage's return. You then have one single level in San Francisco which has no relevance to the plot before the player is finally given the choice between Eddie or Peter at the start of the next level, and even then, you don't always get that choice. This is such a weird, restrictive system. I get taking inspiration from the comics, but not to the point where it limits player choice when it really doesn't have to. Now, on the flip side, it does lead to some replay value. It's hollow replay value, sure, rare, but it is there. You can take specific routes through the game and see a slightly different lineup of stages depending on who you pick. Now, I think personally the better route would have been to have had simplified cutscenes that are more condensed and to offer up additional stages to fill in the gaps and to always allow you a choice between Spider-Man and Venom, narrative be damned. I mean, you can take some liberties. You took enough of them on Wolverine. But then again, by this point, I would have just put co-op in the game. But yeah, let's not break that taboo. The other real negative is just how ball-bustingly hard the game is on a casual playthrough. This isn't to say the enemies exhibit some super intelligent artificial intelligence, because they don't. It's just that Software Creations decided to increase the difficulty as artificially as possible rather than create challenge through mechanics or strategy. You start with 3 lives, 2 continues, and that's it. But no, it's not it. Unlike many other beat-em-ups, especially those that have co-op, when you lose all your lives in Maximum Carnage, you don't get the choice to use a continue and start from where you died. You start all the way back at the beginning of the level. Just adding co-op would have solved this issue, but it seemed like they were going for more of a one-player action game instead, I think. Unfortunately, this difficulty issue only gets more difficult. To heal yourself, again, unlike every beat-em-up ever, health doesn't spawn out of breaking background objects, but rather they spawn immediately out of the bodies of dead enemies. The problem here is that since the movement and feel is more like a brawler, you'll be running and dashing all over the place, hitting other enemies, and you'll accidentally pick up health when you don't need it, unlike breaking boxes or barrels, which is a deliberate choice you make. Just doing this one simple trick would do wonders to smoothing out the overall game difficulty. The enemies and bosses aren't really the issue here, it's just how the health and continuing system works, or doesn't. Next, the levels themselves. Even though there's plenty of locales plucked from the comics, they're all incredibly short or recycled multiple times, like Central Park, the alleyway scene, the street, and the rooftop. If that's not enough, Software Creations also makes the player walk to the right and then walk to the left for no discernible reason other than they simply didn't map out enough level. It smacks of them running out of time and just trying to work within their means, but at the end of the day, these laughably simple level designs really come across as slapdash when compared to even Streets of Rage 1 or the original Final Fight. Those games have stages composed of multiple types of background settings, complete with set pieces and transitions that make for a far more dynamic experience. One other key element to make for a successful brawler is something that Maximum Carnage does the absolute minimum in. Now, when you actually fight Shriek or Cassidy or Doppelganger, you know, it's fine. It's great even. However, the majority of the game's boss fights are usually things like, this. Yeah, it feels like half the time the game throws not super villains, but super lame civilians at you. Now, there is a throwaway line that Carnage's general AoE of madness is what's spurring these New Yorkers into random violence, which is an acceptable kayfabe explanation as to why there's so many in this game. This also plays into their adherence to comic book lore, because if a villain doesn't appear in a particular battle within the pages of Maximum Carnage, well, they don't appear at that point in the game either. Hence why Spidey and co are accosted by so many fat dudes and hair girls throughout the adventure. Again, Software Creations, I don't think any kid would have been angry if they got to fight Shriek or Carnage at the end of level 3 instead of the dreaded Umbrella Brothers. Now, I know the spidey senses of all you Maximum Carnage fans are probably ablaze right now, and that's understandable. Lots of people have wholesome, nostalgic memories of this one, and really, it's only when you start looking deep into the mechanics and design where its flaws are revealed to you. If you pop this in and play super casually though, its audio, visual, and combat are quite strong, so with all my gripes out of the way, let's get into the good stuff. As soon as the logos start up, it no, not that one. Never mind. As soon as they start up, your ears are treated to the subtle 16-bit sounds of Green Jelly. This was a band that couldn't have been more 90s if they tried. Wait, no, they did try. They had a number of their songs simplified and converted for a 16-bit game based on Maximum fucking Carnage. Anyway, while Software Creations did reuse a number of these songs a bunch of times, you can't deny their appeal. There's a rich, high-octane energy to these slappers, and if the soundtrack had been anything else, I think Maximum Carnage wouldn't be remembered as fondly as it is today. Graphically, well, it's a bit of a mixed bag of spiders. Ugh, that even grosses me out. Anyway, no, Peter and Eddie look good. Sprites in general are large, the stages are decently detailed, but things get a little wonky elsewhere. I don't know why Shriek is so stubby and details take an even bigger hit with the jobber civilians, but overall, I think it holds up fine for being a nearly 30-year-old game. Cause yeah, it's a bit unfair to stack Software Creations against what Capcom was putting out in 1994. Where the game really shines graphically is in the cutscenes. They simply took the pages of Maximum Carnage and added in some animation and sound effects, and while there's some missing detail here and there, it's fun seeing artwork you remember so vividly as a kid. Next is the Superhero Striker System, trademark, which I feel is one of the game's best mechanics. Throughout the campaign, you'll find tokens which let you call in other heroes to help if you find yourself getting battered by the dreaded Umbrella Brothers. This lineup includes Black Cat, Captain America, Deathclock, Cloak and Dagger, Firestar, Iron Fist, and finally, our Lord and Savior, good old Morby. Now, what's cool is that the attacks of each hero change depending on who summons them. For example, if Spider-Man calls in Danny, he acts more as a medic and heals Spidey. If Venom gives him a honk, Danny then lets loose with his Iron Fist or foot. It's a nice way to give the combat some variety, and it's fun to see all the different animations. So, in terms of ports, I played through both versions of the game for this video, and while I don't want to get too much into the SNES versus Genesis war, I will! Honestly, it all comes down to what you value more. In a lot of ways, the game is identical on both systems. I think the biggest difference is that, no matter how you slice it, that distinctive green jelly sound comes off way better via the Super Nintendo sound chip rather than the Genesis's. It's just a lot smoother and more pleasant to the ears. But sound effects are a different story. On the Genesis, the sound of flesh on fist is distinct, and I don't know, I think it's better. Graphically though, both versions are much closer. I think the visuals on the Genesis are a bit rougher, but since the game is fairly cartoony anyway, it hardly matters. Gameplay wise, I will say over on Sega, things do feel a bit snappier. I'm not sure if it's faster per se, but I did notice a difference, so I'm gonna give the edge to the Genesis here. As for the Game Gear and arcade versions of Maximum Carnage, well, they suck because they don't exist. Honestly, I think a bigger, badder arcade version of Maximum Carnage would have been dope as hell. Something akin to, the Battletoads arcade game, where you have bigger sprites, more effects, and enemies on screen, maybe a tad more violent, and also, have 2 players. And that's the thing. The console version, as it is brimming with all this untapped potential, almost like it already feels like a watered-down, compromised port of something even better. The Sega Spider-Man arcade brawler I covered last time doesn't quite fit that bill. So while it's nothing amazing or spectacular nowadays, I think nostalgia holds a lot of sway with Maximum Carnage. Just like the comic book event it's based on, it sounds like the most metal, badass thing ever. But once it concludes, it feels more like a basic hollow adventure that lacks the juice and mostly got by on intoxicating 90s hype. So, with that said, I'm going to be giving Maximum Carnage 3 bad Woody Harrelson wigs out of 5. If there's any other games you true believers out there want me to take on next, let me know in the comments below or swing over to my spider Twitter. Until then, Excelsior, dear viewers, and I'll see you next time on the Mediocre Spider Mat.